They said the estate was mine, what was left of it anyway. But from the moment I stepped into that house, I could feel the truth pressing against the walls. They didn't want me here. Not really. They wanted the keys, the legacy, the silence. But they forgot something. I've lived through betrayal before, and this time, I came prepared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Mirabel Hale. I'm 68 years old, twice widowed, and until recently, I believed the worst was behind me. I spent most of my life loving a man who taught me how to endure but never how to fight back. Henry was the kind of husband who shook hands with charm and whispered doubts behind doors. Now that he's gone, his children have returned to claim what they think is theirs. But I was his wife, not his placeholder. And I have no intention of fading quietly into the background they've written for me. I hadn't stepped foot inside the Hale estate in nearly a decade. The gravel crunched beneath the wheels of the hired car as it turned onto the long, frost-lined drive. Winter had settled over the property like a warning. The trees were bare, their branches clawing at the pale sky, and the once manicured hedges had grown unruly, as if nature itself had grown tired of waiting for the house to die. The house hadn't changed. Same stone facade, same towering windows, same heavy iron gate with Henry's initials carved into the center. But it felt smaller now, less like a manor and more like a mausoleum. Perhaps it was the silence. Or maybe it was knowing that Henry's voice would never echo through its halls again. I tightened my coat around me as the car stopped in front of the entryway. No one came out to greet me. Not Elias, with his thin-lipped smile and practiced courtesy. Not Margaret, with her hollow hugs and sharper eyes. Not Thomas, who never bothered pretending at all. The front door creaked open as I reached for the handle. Margaret stood in the threshold, her arms crossed, her mouth already shaped into a polite lie. "Mirabel," she said, stepping aside. "We weren't sure you'd come." "Neither was I replied, brushing past her into the cold breath of the foyer. The air inside was colder than it should have been. A fire burned in the hearth, but it didn't reach the bones of the place. Or mine. The portraits still lined the walls, a parade of Hales from centuries past, staring down with disapproval or disinterest. It was always hard to tell which. I avoided looking at Henry's, recently hung at the end of the hall. His eyes, even in paint, followed me with a weight I wasn't ready to carry. "We've prepared the east wing for you," Margaret said, leading me down the hall. "Thought you'd want privacy." Privacy. Isolation. Same difference. The east wing had always been cold and used. The guest wing. Far from the study. Far from the family rooms. Far from the places where decisions were made. "I suppose this is where widows are kept," I murmured. Margaret didn't answer. She simply placed a hand on the doorframe and gave me a tight smile. "If you need anything, let us know. We're meeting with the estate lawyer in the morning." Of course they were. No mention of including me. No invitation extended. Just a statement of fact. As if I were a guest. As if I hadn't shared Henry's bed, his life, his secrets for over 40 years. I nodded once, not trusting my voice. The room was tidy. Too tidy. Like they had scrubbed it of history. There were no personal touches. No flowers, no photographs. Just sterile sheets and a single folder placed neatly on the writing desk. I closed the door behind me, sat down at the desk, and opened it. Inside were a few documents. A draft of Henry's will, not the original. A list of assets. And a brief letter unsigned, stating, as discussed, Mrs. Hale's share will be reassessed once final valuations are complete. Mrs. Hale. Not Mirabel. Not even my wife. Just Mrs. Hale. Reassessed. I leaned back in the chair, the cold creeping through the cushion and into my spine. They weren't just planning to cut me out. They already had. They thought I wouldn't notice. That I'd sit quietly in this wing, accept their crumbs, and vanish from their lives without protest. But Henry taught me how to listen before he taught me how to speak. And now that he was gone, I had no intention of staying silent. I didn't sleep that night. Not because the room was cold, though it was, or because the bed creaked with every breath. It was the silence. The thick, unnatural silence that only comes from a house filled with people pretending not to speak. I heard them. Not clearly, not enough to catch words, but there were footsteps in the hall, doors opening and closing, the low hum of conversation somewhere deeper in the West Wing. Laughter, once. Quick and nervous. As if someone had remembered I was still in the house. At dawn, I rose, dressed, and walked the long corridor toward Henry's study. It hadn't been mentioned, not once, since I arrived. That was telling. They thought I wouldn't dare go near it. Or worse, they thought I wouldn't know what to look for. The door was locked. Of course it was. But Henry was never clever with hiding things. He kept the spare key behind the second-floor hallway sconce, left side, under the base. I found it where it had always been, a little rusted, a little reluctant, but it turned. The room smelled like tobacco and pine. Dust had settled on everything, but I didn't believe for a second it hadn't been touched since his death. The desk drawers were too clean. The file cabinet too orderly. No man dies suddenly and leaves his affairs in perfect order unless someone else has been tidying them for him. I sat behind the desk and ran my fingers beneath it, around the underside. Still there, a slip of duct tape, holding an old key. The lockbox it belonged to was hidden beneath the floorboard behind the bookshelf. Henry never trusted banks with his real secrets. Only wood and steel. The box creaked open with a groan. Inside were three things: a fountain pen, a worn leather notebook, and a small envelope with my name on it. Just Mirabel. In Henry's sharp, deliberate hand. I opened it slowly. If you're reading this, I'm dead. And if they've brought you back to this house, it means they've already started rewriting the ending. Don't trust them. The real will is not what they've given you. Margaret pushed me to change it. Elias helped her draft the new version behind my back. But I didn't sign what they think I did. I kept the truth with someone I trust. Ask Adrian Ward. H! My breath caught. Adrian Ward. Our old solicitor. Retired 5 years ago. Lived alone in a cottage in the Southern Hills. Henry hadn't spoken to him since the family adjusted to a new legal team. Margaret's suggestion, I now realized, with sick clarity. They didn't just alter the will. They forged it. I folded the letter and tucked it into my coat. The notebook went with it. The pen too, because if they wanted a game, I intended to write my own ending. As I rose from the chair, I caught sight of something in the fireplace, burnt pages. The edge of a folder, half consumed, the name Langdon and Ward LLP, just barely visible through the ash. They tried to erase everything. But they forgot the one rule Henry lived by: never bury a secret without checking if it has roots. And this one had roots. Deep ones. The breakfast table looked like something out of an old portrait, gleaming silver, polished crystal, a spread laid out so perfectly it felt almost apologetic. But no one apologized. Not for the cold shoulder. Not for the silence. Not for the games already unfolding around me. Elias sat at the head, as if the chair had already changed owners. Margaret poured coffee like a hostess, not a sister-in-law. Thomas scrolled through his phone, barely looking up. Did you find everything in the East Wing all right? Elias asked, finally glancing at me with a hollow warmth that didn't reach his eyes. Yes, I replied, sipping tea I didn't ask for. Very quiet down there. Margaret smiled. We thought you might want peace. After everything. Everything. A convenient word when you don't want to say death or fraud or we're stealing what you built. We're meeting the lawyers at 10, Elias continued. Just a formality. You're welcome to sit in, of course. Of course. I nodded, knowing full well they hadn't planned on offering that until I found my way into Henry's study. And the will? I asked lightly. Have you all seen the final version? There was a pause. Subtle. Sharp. Thomas looked up, briefly. Margaret's grip on the coffee pot tightened, just a fraction. And Elias smiled wider, the kind of smile people use when they're hiding knives. "It's all very straightforward," he said. "Henry made things clear." "Henry rarely made anything clear," I said, letting my voice cool just slightly. "But I'm sure you'll walk me through it." Margaret reached for a croissant, her movements too delicate to be natural. "It's best we all remain calm through this process. Grief does strange things to memory." I leaned back. So does guilt. The table stilled for a heartbeat. Thomas finally spoke. "You're implying something, Mirabel. If you've got something to say, say it." I met his eyes. "I always do, Thomas. Just not always when people expect it." He blinked. I smiled. We finished breakfast in silence, save for the faint clink of cutlery against china and the distant tick of the old grandfather clock that had stood in the dining room since Henry's father ran the estate like a kingdom. I excused myself before the final bite and stepped into the corridor. I needed a moment. Not to think, but to remember. Henry had taught me how to read people better than any book. And what I saw now was panic disguised as control. They were rushing. Closing in. Desperate to make something disappear before I could touch it. But they were too late. I already had the letter. The notebook. The name. Adrian Ward. Now all I needed was time. They brought in a new lawyer. Young. Crisp suit. Smelled like cologne and ambition. His name was Devin Marks, and he introduced himself with the confidence of someone who thought he'd walked into a room full of fools. We gathered in the drawing room, chosen, I assumed, for its grandeur. Heavy velvet drapes, antique lamps, a fireplace no one had lit. Elias sat across from me, Margaret beside him. Thomas leaned against the wall, arms folded like he couldn't be bothered to care. Devin cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale, Mirabel, is it? Thank you for joining us. I'll be walking everyone through the current structure of the estate." Current structure. Not original. Not intended. That was the first red flag. "I assume you're not from Langdon and Ward," I said, even though I knew the answer. A flicker passed across his face. "No, ma'am. I represent the Hale family's updated legal interests." "And when, exactly, were those updated?" He shifted, ever so slightly. "Roughly 6 months ago." 6 months. That would be just after Henry's last hospitalization. The same time he'd grown quieter. Worn down. That was when they moved in, when Margaret started handling his paperwork, when Elias began talking to him alone more often. "I don't recall being informed," I said. "Well," Devin said, glancing at Elias, "I believe Mr. Hale may have handled those transitions independently. The documents are here, and I'd like to see the original will," I said. Another pause. A quick glance between Elias and Margaret. "This is the final signed version," Elias said smoothly. "The only one that matters." "I wasn't asking what mattered," I replied. "I asked for the original." Devin hesitated. "Unfortunately, Mrs. Hale, we don't seem to have a copy of that on file. It may have been superseded and discarded in the process of revision." Margaret cut in then, her voice honeyed. "Mirabel, this doesn't have to be contentious. Henry made sure you'd be taken care of. A generous allowance. Full residence privileges. Nothing is being withheld from you. Except the truth. Except my name on the assets. Except the house that I kept afloat during the years Henry could barely manage the business." "You expect me to sign off on this?" I asked. "No one's asking you to sign anything yet," Elias said calmly. "But we do hope you'll be reasonable. It's what Henry wanted." They kept using his name like a weapon. What Henry wanted. As if I hadn't been the one beside him in his final weeks, holding his hand while they circled outside the door like vultures. I didn't argue. Not yet. Instead, I stood. If this is what you call a formality, I'd hate to see a negotiation. Devin smiled tightly. "You're free to seek outside counsel, of course." "I already have," I said, and watched the color drain slightly from Margaret's face. They weren't sure if I was bluffing. I wasn't. Henry's letter was tucked safely in my coat. The notebook, too. I'd already drafted a message to Adrian Ward, and if I had to knock on his cottage door myself, I would. Let them think I was playing nice. Let them think I was confused, overwhelmed, cornered. Because while they spun their lies behind velvet curtains and polished floors, I was already peeling back the wallpaper and finding rot underneath. By the time the snow started falling that evening, the house felt heavier. As if it, too, was weighed down by the lies echoing through its walls. I waited until the others were distracted, Margaret on a call in the conservatory, Elias and Devon holed up in the study pretending to discuss logistics, and Thomas off somewhere brooding, as he did best. I moved quietly through the West Wing hall, the one that led toward the family library. It had been locked for years. Henry stopped using it after the fire, just a small one, a chimney flare-up that scorched one wall and filled the room with smoke. No one was hurt, but Henry claimed the place held bad air after that. I never quite believed it. What he didn't know was that I'd visited that room long after he stopped. There was a seam in the bookshelf, a thin crack in the wood where the panel met the wall. Henry never noticed it, but I had. A room behind the books, hidden decades ago by one of his great-uncles during the Prohibition era. A panic room, maybe? Or something less innocent. I pressed my fingers to the third book on the fourth shelf, Weathering the War Years, a dull historical volume no one ever read, and gave it a twist. A soft click answered. The panel slid open an inch. My breath caught, then steadied. I pulled the door open fully, revealing the narrow passage that led behind the library. Dust swirled in the air like breath from the walls. Inside, the space was barely lit. Just one window, blacked out by old wood, and a table with a few scattered files left behind long ago. I turned on the flashlight I'd brought and stepped inside. The files were brittle with age, old ledgers, war bonds, forgotten property deeds. But under the table, wedged between the floorboards, was a wrapped bundle. Oilskin cloth, tied with string. I pulled it free and unwrapped it with shaking fingers. Inside were 5 items, a copy of Henry's first will. A family trust deed that included my name, co-executor, not just beneficiary. A sealed envelope addressed to Adrian Ward. A photograph of Henry with Adrian, dated just 8 months ago. And a signed letter witnessed and notarized, revoking any future amendments unless filed in Ward's presence. My chest tightened. This was it. The truth. The legal heartbeat of the estate, buried in a forgotten wall. I gathered the bundle, rewrapped it, and tucked it into my coat. When I turned to leave, I paused. A soft creak sounded in the hall beyond the panel. I froze, heart pounding. Then silence. I stepped out and slid the panel closed behind me. Whoever it was, if anyone had seen, would have questions. But I had answers now. And if they were planning to bury me with forged papers and barbed smiles, they were going to need a deeper grave. Because I was no longer just a widow drifting in the dark. I was a woman with a key, a name, and a war chest. The next morning, I dressed deliberately. Not in mourning black, nor the soft grays they expected of a grieving widow. I wore navy silk, sharp, structured, the same dress Henry once called too formal for breakfast. Good. I wasn't here to eat croissants and sip apologies. I arrived at the breakfast table before the others. When Margaret walked in, she stopped mid-step. "You're up early," she said, her smile flickering. "I find I sleep better when I'm not being lied to." Her smile vanished. Elias and Thomas followed. No one sat at the head of the table today. They hesitated. Margaret finally took her seat, carefully folding her napkin. The air between us was brittle. "I've asked Adrian Ward to come," I said, buttering my toast. Thomas scoffed. "That fossil? He's retired." And yet, I replied, he still answers his phone. Said he'd be here by noon. Margaret's cup clinked too loudly in her saucer. There's no need to involve Adrian. Everything's been handled through the proper channels. Proper, perhaps. Legal. I set down my knife. We'll see. Elias leaned forward, lacing his fingers. Mirabel, if you think you're going to scare us with theatrics, I suggest you reconsider. I don't want to scare you, Elias. I want to show you what I found. I opened my handbag and placed the sealed envelope on the table, letting it rest like a quiet bomb. The original will, the family trust deed, and a signed letter from Henry himself revoking any amendments made outside of Adrian Ward's office. All witnessed. All real. All dated before your little restructuring. Margaret paled. Thomas stood. You're bluffing, he hissed. Then sit back down and wait for the knock on the door, I said. You'll find out soon enough. We sat in silence. My heart thundered in my chest, but I didn't let it show. Not this time. I'd spent years swallowing my instincts, learning to make myself smaller so they could feel bigger. No more. At 12:04, the doorbell rang. The butler, God bless old Lionel, announced Adrian Ward's arrival like it was the second coming. And in some way, for me, it was. Adrian stepped into the room with his leather briefcase and that same tired but sharp glint in his eye. His gaze swept over the table and settled on me. Mirabel, he said gently, I believe it's time we corrected the record. And just like that, everything began to shift. Adrian Ward didn't raise his voice. He never had to. There was something about his presence, measured, unshakable, that commanded attention. Even Thomas, who usually had something arrogant loaded on his tongue, stood still when Adrian pulled the documents from his briefcase. These, Adrian said, placing the papers in the center of the table, are the last officially recognized documents signed and witnessed by Henry James Hale. Dated March 3rd, witnessed by myself and 2 others, notarized, filed under the original Hale Family Trust. He looked up, gaze cold as glass. They predate any changes made by other parties, especially those executed without Henry's full consent or legal awareness. Margaret's face drained of all color. Elias opened his mouth, closed it again. I watched them, these 3 adults who had played at control, smiling over tea while they drew up plans to erase me, start to crack. Thomas finally muttered, that doesn't mean anything. People revise wills all the time. Adrian turned to him. Yes, and when they do so in accordance with the law. Not behind closed doors. Not without their lawyer present. Not when the primary executor of the trust, Mirabel, is deliberately excluded. Margaret rose from her seat. This is absurd. Henry wasn't well. He told me. Adrian held up a hand, calm but firm. Henry was perfectly capable of understanding his estate. And his intentions were clear. He wanted Mirabel to be not only cared for, but named executor with full access to all assets and decisions regarding the estate. Any alteration made after that document, particularly under suspicious circumstances, will not hold. Elias looked at me then, not with his usual dismissal, but with something closer to realization. To fear. You planned this, he said quietly. No, I replied. You did. You pushed too far. You got greedy. All I did was follow the breadcrumbs you left behind. Adrian tapped the table. I'll be filing for a formal review with the probate court. I recommend you each get legal counsel. This isn't just an inheritance dispute anymore. It may become something more. Criminal. The room turned to stone. Margaret sat down slowly, hands trembling. Thomas didn't look at anyone. Elias looked at me again, but this time, it wasn't with contempt. It was with respect. Bitter, reluctant, too late, but it was there. Adrian packed his briefcase and turned to me. You'll want to stay on the property until this is resolved. You're protected under the trust, but we don't want them moving anything financially or otherwise. I'm not going anywhere, I said. I stood as they remained seated, and for the first time since Henry's death, I didn't feel like the outsider in the room. I felt like the one in control. The storm that followed Adrian's visit wasn't loud. Not at first. It came in hushed arguments behind closed doors, phone calls that ended with slammed receivers, and a sudden flurry of activity that made the halls of the estate buzz like a disturbed hive. For a house so obsessed with appearances, it had become increasingly hard for them to hide the unraveling. Margaret avoided me entirely. She disappeared into rooms when I entered them, claimed migraines, sent messages through Lionel instead of speaking directly. Elias tried to maintain a facade of civility, offering me breakfast, commenting on the weather, asking if I needed anything, as if small talk could plaster over weeks of quiet betrayal. And Thomas. He watched me, always from a distance. Silent, narrow-eyed, calculating. Like he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't believe had solved him first. I took my tea on the terrace that morning, overlooking the frost-laced gardens. They used to be beautiful, those gardens. Henry and I had planted the roses together our first year at the estate. But no one had tended them since. They'd overgrown, thorns crawling over one another, petals frozen stiff in the winter wind. I didn't mind. There was something honest in their wildness. Lionel approached quietly and handed me a note, no envelope, just folded once, with handwriting I didn't recognize. I opened it. Meet me in the cellar. Midnight. Come alone. T. I didn't need a signature to know who T was. Thomas. He was the last one I expected to make a move, and yet, something in him had always been closer to the edge than the others. Less controlled. Less polished. I folded the note and stared out across the garden. If he thought this was a threat, he'd be disappointed. I'd lived too many years walking on eggshells to fear another pair. And if it wasn't a threat, if it was something else, then I had questions of my own. Midnight would come soon enough. And I'd be ready. The cellar door groaned like a reluctant confession when I pulled it open. It was 5 minutes to midnight. The estate was asleep, or pretending to be. I moved in silence, careful on the creaking steps, the light from my flashlight quivering across old stone walls and shelves filled with dust-covered wine bottles. The cellar had always unsettled me. It was too cold, too quiet, too far from the rest of the house. It held a dampness that felt like memory, like all the forgotten things clinging to the stones. But tonight I wasn't afraid. Thomas was already there, standing near an old workbench, arms crossed, eyes sharp. You came, he said. You asked, I replied. He said nothing for a moment, just stared at the ground, then back at me. There was something behind his face, a flicker of unease, maybe guilt, maybe something worse. I didn't agree with what they did, he said. Not fully, but I didn't stop it either. No, I said quietly. You didn't. He ran a hand through his hair. Elias and Margaret, they pushed everything through so fast. I don't know what I thought. That you wouldn't fight back. That you didn't care about the money. I didn't, I said. Not until they tried to take everything. He nodded, shame flickering across his face. They forged the signature, you know. The new will. It wasn't even a good forgery. But they figured no one would look too hard. They said you'd be too broken. I let the silence sit between us. Then, why tell me now? He hesitated, then pulled something from his coat pocket. A flash drive. I made a copy, he said, of the documents, the scans, the emails, even the versions they edited. I didn't know why I kept it. Maybe I just wanted leverage. Maybe part of me hoped you'd find out. I reached for it slowly, carefully. He let it go. Why give it to me now? He shrugged, but his voice cracked. Because watching Margaret call the shots while Elias paraded around like he owned the place, it made me sick. And because you're the only one in this house who ever looked at me like I wasn't just a liability. The words hit deeper than I expected. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, angry, lost, trying to earn a father's attention that never came. I don't forgive you, I said. I know. But this helps. We stood there for a beat longer. Then I turned and left him there in the dark. Not as punishment, but because I had what I came for. And tomorrow, everything would change. By morning, I had everything in place. The flash drive Thomas gave me held more than I hoped for. Scanned pages of the forged will with subtle mismatches in Henry's signature, emails between Margaret and Devon discussing expedited filing, and most damning of all, a handwritten note from Elias, outlining timelines for removing me from the estate as discreetly as possible. Discreet. That word stuck with me like a sliver of glass. I sat in the drawing room with Adrian, sunlight slanting through the frost-glazed windows. He wore his usual stoic expression, but when I handed him the flash drive and he skimmed the printed contents I'd prepared, his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "This is enough," he said after a moment. "More than enough." "Good," I replied. "Then let's stop pretending we're playing their game." He nodded. "I'll have my office contact the probate court today. We'll request an emergency injunction, freeze all assets, and begin proceedings to nullify the revised will." "They'll try to bury it," I said. "They won't be fast enough." I stood and faced the fireplace. The portrait of Henry loomed above it, his painted eyes distant, as if he knew the storm he'd left behind. "Did he ever know what they were planning?" I asked. Adrian hesitated. "I think he suspected. Toward the end, he grew paranoid, more protective of you, of the estate. He said once that he was worried they'd use his death as a reset button. They almost did. But you stopped them." I turned back toward him. "Not yet. But I will." That afternoon, I called a family meeting. They arrived slowly, suspicious, unwilling. Margaret entered first, chin high, dressed in funeral black though no one had died that day. Elias came next, frowning, already combative. Thomas followed last and stood near the door, silent. "I assume this is about your little performance," Elias said. "No," I said. "This is about your reckoning." I handed Adrian the floor. He spoke calmly, directly, laying out the evidence, the process, and the consequences. Margaret paled. Elias erupted, blustering, accusing, threatening legal retaliation. But I didn't flinch. I let them spiral. Then I dropped the final match. "The papers you filed weren't just void. They were criminal," I said. "And if I push this forward, you won't just lose the estate. You'll face charges." Margaret's voice cracked. "You wouldn't dare." "I would. And I will, unless you do exactly as I say." Silence. Then Elias, "What do you want?" I smiled, slow and sharp. "Control. Of the estate. The assets. The board seats. Everything. And if we refuse?" I leaned in. "Then I'll show the court exactly how your father died with 3 traitors at his bedside." They didn't answer. They didn't need to, because in that moment, they knew I wasn't asking. I was taking back what was already mine. The storm broke behind closed doors. After the meeting, they scattered. Elias vanished into the library, likely calling Devon, barking threats into the phone that no longer had the power to protect him. Margaret locked herself in her bedroom. And Thomas lingered in the hallway for a moment before walking out into the snow alone. I let them flail. It was their turn. Adrian stayed with me through the afternoon, preparing the final documents. Emergency motion filed. Probate court notified. Bank accounts frozen until the rightful authority, me, was reinstated. We moved quickly. Quietly. Precisely. By dusk, the tide had turned entirely. Margaret came to me first. Her knock was soft, almost childlike. When I opened the door, she looked smaller somehow, less polished. The makeup had worn off, and what remained was a woman who had built her power on shadows and now stood stripped beneath the light. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said. I stared at her for a long time. "Didn't you?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. It was supposed to be clean. Seamless. Just. Easier. For whom? For everyone. "No," I said. "Just for you." She looked down, ashamed or pretending to be. I no longer cared which. "I've drafted a statement," I said, handing her a printed page. "You'll sign it. A full admission of involvement, but under the condition that you and Elias relinquish all claims to the estate. Quietly. No press. No lawyers. Just gone. Her hands trembled as she took it. "And Thomas, he can stay. On my terms." She read it, lips moving silently. When she looked back up, something in her eyes had hardened again. But the fight was gone. That mattered more. She signed. Elias fought harder. Raged. Threatened. Refused. But when he realized Margaret had already surrendered and that the banks were no longer answering his calls, he folded too, less gracefully, more bitterly. "I hope it was worth it," he said as he signed his name with a sneer. "It will be," I replied. And then, like that, it was over. The house exhaled. The weight shifted. I stood in the grand hallway that night, alone, listening to the silence not as a threat, but as peace. They tried to erase me, but I remained, not as a victim, as the last Hale standing. 3 weeks passed. The snow melted slowly from the gardens, revealing the twisted remains of what once bloomed. Dead stems, wilted petals, roots tangled and black. It felt right, somehow, like the earth itself had gone through its own reckoning and was deciding what to keep. The estate was quiet now. Not the heavy kind of quiet that came with secrets, but the kind that followed resolution. The storm had passed, and in its place was space, room to breathe, to walk, to remember. Elias and Margaret were gone. Officially. No press release. No goodbye. Just signatures, luggage, and silence. Thomas stayed, not out of pity or guilt, but choice. He came to me on the 4th morning after their departure, standing in the doorway of Henry's old study. "I'd like to help," he said. "With the estate. With the renovations. With rebuilding." He didn't say forgiveness, and I was grateful. We weren't there. Maybe we'd never be. But the offer was honest. And honesty was a rarity in this house. "You'll start at the bottom," I told him. He nodded. I assumed. We didn't speak more than that. He started clearing out the storage rooms, cataloging what had been lost, what was worth saving. Slowly, the house began to shift. One afternoon, I sat in the East Wing again, the wing they had once placed me in to forget me. But now it was mine in every sense. I had it renovated into a sunroom, new windows, fresh paint. The furniture was soft and warm, made for comfort, not appearances. Adrian visited often. He said the court proceedings would end quietly. No charges. Not unless I pushed. I didn't. I had what I needed. "I've never seen someone take back so much with so little noise," he said once. I smiled. "You haven't seen my full range." He laughed. "Something tells me I don't want to." And maybe he was right. Because this wasn't just about inheritance or power. It was about being seen, heard, respected. And they had taken that from me for far too long. Now, as I sat by the window, tea in hand, the sun dipping low beyond the frost-tipped hills, I finally let myself feel it peace. Earned, not given. Built from ashes, not inherited by blood. Spring came slow and cautious to the estate. The frost retreated in reluctant inches, revealing earth that hadn't breathed properly in years. The roses had died, truly this time. Even the strongest roots had given in to neglect. I let them go. Some things weren't meant to bloom again. But the orchard survived. Tiny green shoots curled up from under the leaf litter one morning in April, and I stood alone beneath the old pear tree, letting the wind tangle my hair like it used to when I was young and full of other people's plans. Now everything here was mine. The house, the land, the silence. It no longer echoed with the lies of those who tried to strip me of my name, my years, my place. It spoke in softer tones now, wood settling, windows creaking, birds returning to the eaves. A different kind of voice, one I finally recognized. I walked the halls without watching my back. I slept with the doors unlocked. Lionel stayed on as housekeeper, but more as a companion these days. He started calling me ma'am again, not because he had to, but because it felt like honor instead of habit. Thomas worked daily on the estate's accounts and repairs. He never asked for credit. I never offered absolution. but there was a quiet understanding between us. He had betrayed me once, yes, but he'd also handed me the match I needed to burn their lies to the ground. Sometimes it's not who starts the fire, it's who hands you the torch. One morning, I returned to the study, Henry's study, now mine. I placed a new portrait above the fireplace. Not of him, of me. Painted from memory, from stillness, from truth. No pearls, no pretense. Just an older woman, standing in the same garden they once left to rot, face forward, eyes steady. And beneath it, etched into the frame, she remained. Because in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the title, not the will, not even the money, but the fact that they tried to erase me and failed. I closed the study door behind me and smiled to myself. I wasn't just part of the Hale legacy anymore. I was its future. Here the story ends. Thanks for watching. Hit like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more true and real stories.